The poem Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes is one of several poems in the AQA Power and Conflict collection which deals with the theme of armed conflict and specifically here World War I. In terms of teaching sequence, I usually tackle this poem after we've read the poem Charge of the Light Brigade and Exposure, and this is because the former of these poems was written before World War I, with the latter being written during World War I. So the fact that Bayonet Charge was written about World War I but after it gives us quite an interesting third perspective on this topic. The poem begins very abruptly with the adverb suddenly, sending the reader straight into the heat of battle. Suddenly he awoke and was running, raw, in raw-seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire, hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air. He lugged a rifle, numb as a smashed arm, the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. So we quickly realised that the he being referred to in this poem is a soldier who has just gone over the top and is now running towards the enemy who are firing at him from behind this green hedge on the other side of no man's land. Now Hughes uses a number of present tense verbs. We have the word running and stumbling, smacking and sweating at the end here, and this gives the reader a sense of the action being put right before our eyes. It creates a sense of immediacy and pace, which is also characterised throughout the rest of the poem. There are a number of different senses used in this part of the poem as well. We have the word raw repeated twice here, perhaps to suggest the uncomfortable nature of the uniform that he's wearing, hot, sweaty, and perhaps rubbing his skin raw, but also the rawness of the emotion he is feeling and the fear which ultimately consumes him. We also see the dazzle of rifle fire, the clods of torn up earth, and we hear the bullets smacking the belly out of the air. It's quite interesting to note that despite this presence of so many different senses, there are no other human beings which are mentioned in this poem, despite the implied presence of the soldiers who would have surely accompanied him over the top, as well as the enemy who are certainly shooting at him from the opposite trench. But this absence of direct recognition has a very isolating effect on the soldier, who appears to be alone as he runs with almost tunnel vision towards the green hedge. So this first stanza is full of pace and action, which, as I've said, is partly created through the present tense verbs, partly created through the action being described. He's running and bullets are being fired all around him. But it's also created through the structural technique of enjambment, which is where the sentence extends beyond the line of poetry. Now, I've highlighted this piece of personification in line 5 because it's got quite a few interesting effects. Firstly, it suggests the violence which is being done to nature through this conflict, but also in combination with the simile here in the following line, it hints at some of the injuries which may be being done to the soldiers who are falling around him. Now, I've talked about the use of present tense verbs in this poem, but in line 7, Hughes subtly changes the tense. He describes the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, and this tells us that the tear did not fill his eye as he was running towards the enemy, but at some point before, maybe as he was waiting in the trench, full of idealistic thoughts of heroism and honour before being given the signal to advance. And this might also suggest that this is the first time that this soldier has gone over the top. And so, thematically, perhaps this poem is about the moment when youthful patriotism meets the reality of war. So there is a dramatic change in pace in the second stanza, and much of it seems to take place as if in slow motion. In bewilderment then, he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? He was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running, and his foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. Now, the fact that the soldier's foot is described as being like statuary, in other words, like a statue, it seems to suggest that the soldier has had a sudden moment of realisation. And in fact, the stanza is full of confusion and questioning, which begins by him being described as in a state of bewilderment. A question is then asked as we enter the conscience of the soldier. In what cold clockwork of the stars and nations was he the hand pointing that second? I think he is beginning in this part of the poem to question his role in the conflict, and there is a sense of him being exploited by larger powers represented by the cold clockwork. The patriotic tear of the previous stanza has become a realisation that he is just a cog in the cold, emotionless machine of war. The image is continued in the next line with the soldier being compared to the hand of a clock pointing at the enemy. It's quite a neat link to the bayonet he's carrying, but as I said, controlled by some other larger power. And this sense of confusion is further enhanced in the next part of the poem, where he's described as being in the dark, as in lacking understanding, while searching for the reason on purpose, or the purpose for his running at the enemy. The final line in stanza 2 contains what is called a caesura, which is a deliberate break in the middle of a line of poetry created by a piece of punctuation, and in this case, a full stop. And this creates a couple of effects. Firstly, it separates the slow motion, statuary part of the poem from the rapid increase in pace which follows it. The hiatus is now over, and the soldier's awareness switches from an internal mood of contemplation to an awareness of the battle going on around him. It also increases the pace of the poem again. The massive firing of guns indicated by the shot-slashed furrows cannot even wait for the next stanza, but blasts into it. Then the shot-slashed furrows threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide open, silent, its eyes standing out. He plunged past with his bayonet towards the green hedge. King, honour, human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm to get out of that blue crackling air, his terrors touchy dynamite. So the first 3 lines here in this final stanza are slightly ambiguous, and I'm going to offer you a couple of possible interpretations to consider. The first is that the shells and shooting of weapons frightens an actual hare, which runs around in terrified circles, its eyes standing out and its mouth wide. And perhaps this might serve to represent the fear of the soldier, or to suggest the negative effect that this war was having on nature and the environment. And we've mentioned that Hughes is concerned with this in this poem as well. There is evidence for this argument which can be found by looking at other references to nature which Hughes puts into this poem, such as the field of clods, the green hedges, the furrows and the threshing. The second interpretation of these lines takes a bit of explaining, but I'm going to give it a go anyway. So to begin, you need to think that there isn't literally a hare there, that the hare is simply a piece of figurative language, a simile, where one thing is compared to something else. A yellow hair that rolled like a flame. But that doesn't quite make sense. So what happened if we were to reverse the order of what is being compared? So the line in fact reads, as I've got it here, a flame that rolled like a yellow hair. Now, this makes much more sense and might help us to imagine the movement of flame perhaps from an exploding shell. If it is an explosion being described, then we can also follow this image on and imagine the circular wide mouth of the craters which so dominated the landscape of World War I. The question then remains, well, why reverse the simile at all? And the answer may be that Hughes is trying to say something about the world of the soldier, which has been turned upside down through the structure of the poem. Or that his value system, fighting for king, honour and human dignity, has now been reversed. The etc., which follows this list of ideals, certainly seems to support this view, as these values are reduced to meaningless luxuries which simply don't matter anymore. The only thing which seems to concern him now is to get out, and his panic increases to a yelling alarm which is ready to explode. And the alliterative T's here and here, which connect terror and touchy, combined with the onomatopoeic crackling in the previous line, sound like sparks ready to light his fear into pure terror.